When I was in second grade, my biggest concern was choosing the right color for my drawings. I loved art class. It was a refuge where I could let my imagination run wild, far from equations and grammar. It was a typical sunny day, and our classroom was full of laughter and lively conversations as everyone worked on their own art projects. Our teacher, Mrs. Martins, a kind woman with a constant smile, walked around the room, praising our work and offering tips. The smell of crayons and paint mixed in the air, creating an atmosphere of creativity and innocence. The walls were decorated with our drawings, some already yellowed with age, and the worn wooden furniture told stories of past generations. I was focused on drawing a house with a large garden, my hands dirty with green paint. The room was filled with colors, and the sound of chairs scraping and pencils scribbling on paper was a comforting sound, the perfect representation of childhood. My classmates and I were a close-knit group, sharing laughs and stories as we worked. There was a sense of safety in that space, a protected bubble where nothing bad could happen. Little did we know that this bubble was about to burst, and our lives would be marked by an event we would never forget. Mrs. Martins asked us to finish our drawings because it would soon be time for recess. I was excited to show my work to my friends, imagining the adventures we would create together in the playground. But at that moment, as I was adding the finishing touches to my drawing, the tranquility of our day was abruptly interrupted. The shrill sound of the lockdown alarm echoed through the room, interrupting our moment of peace. It was a sound different from the usual recess or end-of-class bell, sharper and more prolonged, which immediately made my heart race. We all stopped drawing and looked around, confused and scared. Mrs. Martins, who was standing next to a classmate correcting a drawing, went pale. Her eyes widened for a moment before she assumed a serious and controlled expression. "Children, come to the back of the room now," she said, trying to keep calm in her voice, but there was a perceptible tremor. My classmates began to move, leaving their art supplies behind. Some were whimpering. Others seemed dazed, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. I stood up, still holding my brush, feeling a wave of fear spread through my body. We followed Mrs. Martin's instructions, who guided us to a corner of the room, away from the windows. She began to close the blinds and lock the door, while some of the children started crying openly. "Everything will be fine," she repeated, but her eyes betrayed an anxiety she couldn't hide. That corner of the room, which once seemed safe and familiar, suddenly became a place of uncertainty and terror. I sat next to my best friend João, who had his face buried in his hands. "What's happening?" he asked, and I had no answer. Trying to be brave, Mrs. Martin spoke again, this time more firmly. "We need to stay quiet and follow instructions, okay? Well, wait here until it's safe." The tension was palpable, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the alarm. As we waited, the sound of the alarm continued, cutting through the air like a blade. I could hear the sobs of my classmates, and a deep fear settled in me. All I could think about was my parents, wishing they were there to protect me. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Time stretched out tortuously, and every little noise seemed amplified. We were all petrified. Mrs. Martins continued to stand by the door, vigilant, like our only line of defense against the unknown outside. The atmosphere was tense and silent, which only accentuated the sound of our racing hearts. The darkness of the room, combined with the constant blare of the alarm, created a palpable atmosphere of fear. Sitting on the floor in a tight space, I could feel the warmth and panic of my classmates around me. Every movement seemed amplified, every sigh a deafening sound in the forced quiet. Suddenly, we began to hear external sounds. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, increasing our sense of vulnerability. It felt like the danger was getting closer and closer. Muffled voices echoed, and we could hear orders being given, but we couldn't understand what they were saying. Each sound was a new wave of terror that swept through the room. We were all trying to make as little noise as possible, even our breaths were controlled. I held my breath several times, trying to listen better and understand what was happening outside. The uncertainty was suffocating. My imagination ran wild, creating horrible scenarios of armed men invading the school. The room was filled with fear, and any small noise seemed potentially dangerous. I was in a constant state of alert, my senses heightened and my nerves on edge. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made my skin crawl, and the muffled voices only added to the atmosphere of terror. As we huddled in the back of the room, Mrs. Martins kept trying to calm us, though her own anxiety was evident. She kept whispering that everything would be fine, that we were safe, and that the police were handling the situation. Her words were a thread of hope that we clung to desperately, but the fear was still palpable in the air. I watched Mrs. Martins as she tried to keep the situation under control. Her voice, usually full of energy and enthusiasm, was now laden with forced calm. She moved from child to child, offering words of comfort, holding small trembling hands and wiping tears from frightened faces. At one point, she picked up the phone in the room and tried to call the school administration. We could hear the tension in her voice as she explained the situation, but the responses were short and uncertain. Communication seemed fragile, and I could see the frustration growing on her face. "They are taking care of it, children. Stay calm," she said, putting the phone back on the hook. She also tried using a communication radio that was in the room, but the static and lack of clear response only increased the sense of isolation. Each attempt at communication seemed futile, and the uncertainty hung over us like a dark cloud. The feeling of disconnection from the outside world heightened our fear, leaving us at the mercy of indistinct sounds and horrible assumptions. While Mrs. Martins continued her attempts at communication, we, the children, tried to process the gravity of the situation. The sound of the alarm, which had been constant, now seemed distant, muffled by the weight of fear and anxiety. I tried to focus on our teacher's reassuring words, but the uncertainty was an overwhelming force. The minutes passed slowly, each one bringing a new wave of panic. Mrs. Martins, with her soft voice, kept trying to calm us, but the echo of her own insecurity was evident. We were all together, but each of us felt alone in our own fear. The connection to the outside world was tenuous, and the reality of the lockdown enveloped us in a mantle of silent despair. Time seemed to drag on as we crouched at the back of the room, trying to control our fear. Mrs. Martins continued her attempts at communication, but each time she hung up the phone or radio, the tension increased. It was then that finally, a clear response came over the radio. A firm and urgent voice informed us that there was an armed man in the school parking lot, carrying an assault rifle. The news hit us like a bomb, and the effect was immediate. The children, already terrified, went into a state of near-total panic. The muffled sobs turned into desperate cries, and the room, which had been tense, was now filled with pure terror. I felt my heart race even faster, as if it could explode at any moment. The information seemed surreal, something I had only seen in movies or heard about on the news. But now it was real, happening right there, and we were in the middle of it. The fear I already felt intensified, turning into paralyzing dread. Mrs. Martins tried to calm us again, but her own voice was trembling. "Stay calm, children. The police are here and will protect us. We need to be strong and stay together." But even she seemed to struggle to maintain her composure. The fact that she couldn't hide her own fear only increased ours. I looked around, seeing the terrified faces of my classmates. Some were hugging, others were trying to hide their faces in their hands, as if that could ward off the fear. Maria, who had been huddled in the corner, was now crying openly, and I could see Joao trembling uncontrollably. The sound of footsteps and voices in the hallway now seemed much closer, and each new noise was like a blow to my heart. Every creak, every sound of movement made my mind imagine the worst. We were all trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I wanted my parents to be there, to hug me and tell me everything would be fine, but instead, We were there, surrounded by fear and uncertainty. The information about the armed man turned our panic into absolute terror, and the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Mrs. Martins continued trying to keep calm, but the truth was that we were all terrified. The threat outside was real and imminent, and all we could do was wait and hope that the police would save us. The shock of discovering that we were in real danger was a moment we would never forget, an event that would mark our young lives forever. The sound of footsteps and voices in the hallway became louder and more frantic. We could hear orders being given, muffled shouts of command, and then, suddenly, the unmistakable crack of gunshots. The sound of the shots reverberated through the school hallways, each one echoing like thunder in our ears. It felt as if each explosion shook my body, amplifying my fear in a way I had never experienced before. Mrs. Martins ordered us to crouch even lower, almost lying on the floor. "Stay quiet, don't make any noise," she whispered, her voice a mix of panic and determination. I could see the sweat dripping down her face, her eyes wide and fixed on the locked door. Every child was motionless, some with their hands over their ears, trying to block out the terrifying sound of the gunshots. Time seemed to have stopped, and each second dragged on like an eternity. The sound of gunfire was interspersed with shouts and urgent commands. The walls that had once protected us now seemed fragile, incapable of keeping us safe. I could feel the dread in the air, almost tangible, as we all waited for the outcome. I looked at the faces of my classmates, all pale and filled with fear. The sobbing of some children was muffled but constant, a continuous reminder of our vulnerability. João next to me was gripping my hand so tightly it hurt, but I didn't mind. His presence and that of all my classmates was the only comfort in the chaos. Suddenly, the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost as frightening as the shots themselves. We remained motionless, waiting for any sign of what was happening outside. I felt my heart beating so fast it seemed like it would burst out of my chest. My breathing was shallow and ragged, each breath a struggle to stay calm. After what felt like an eternity, we heard heavier, more deliberate footsteps approaching. "It's the police. We're safe," Mrs. Martin said, her voice choked with relief. Even then, no one moved. We were all frozen with fear, unable to believe that the danger had passed. The classroom door was slowly opened, and a police officer appeared, his expression serious but relieved. "It's okay now. The danger is over," he said, but we still didn't move. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The officer entered, followed by others, and only then did we start to move, still trembling with fear and relief. Mrs. Martins gathered us, still trying to calm us, but the tears of relief began to roll down everyone's faces. The terror of the confrontation was over, but the impact of that moment would stay with us forever. We were safe, but we would never be the same. When the police officer entered the room and told us the danger had passed, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. It was hard to process the idea that we were finally safe. The children began to get up slowly, still trembling and tearful, while Mrs. Martins tried to gather us all in a collective hug, offering as much comfort as possible. The police helped us out of the room, ensuring the way was safe. As we walked through the hallways, we could see the aftermath of the chaos that had unfolded. Broken glass, overturned furniture, and bullet marks on the walls. Each sign of the confrontation was a tangible reminder of the terror we had lived through. Outside the building, we saw several police cars, ambulances, and even a news van. Our parents were already there, anxiously waiting for news. The moment I saw my mother running towards me was one of the most emotional of my life. She hugged me so tightly, I could barely breathe. But it was the most comforting hug I had ever felt. In the days and weeks that followed, the school tried to return to normal, but nothing seemed the same. The incident had left an indelible mark on all of us. The presence of counselors and psychologists became constant, helping us deal with the trauma we carried. Many of us, including me, suffered nightmares and constant fear, even in the most ordinary situations. Reflecting on what happened, I realized how fragile our sense of security is in everyday life. That sunny, ordinary day had turned into a nightmare in a matter of minutes, and it changed my perspective on many things. I learned to value each moment of peace and the strength of the community in times of crisis. The courage of Mrs. Martins, the quick response of the police, and the solidarity among my classmates are things I will never forget. The fear we felt that day was overwhelming, but it also taught us about resilience and unity. Although the armed man was neutralized and none of us were physically harmed, the emotional scars were deep. The incident was widely covered by the media, but the reports couldn't fully capture the terror and trauma we experienced. To the outside world, we were just a news story for a day, but to us, it was an event that shaped us forever. Today, I still carry the lessons of that day with me. The importance of being prepared, being brave in the face of fear, and supporting each other in times of crisis are values that now guide my life. That day in second grade is behind me, but the memories and teachings remain, always reminding me how life can change in an instant and how human strength can emerge in the darkest moments.